And we are back. Thank you so much for our previous presenters, Ryan at Mother Duck and Ping over in Thailand. I appreciate you both. We are up to our next presenter here, Hacking Tableau 101. I'm excited for this one. Timothy, how are you, my friend?
Very good, Kevin. Thank you.
Timothy has been with the community for a long time. If you are on our Slack channel, he is very active there. So, and BizStory is one of our favorite partners. So, we're very happy to have Timothy here with us. Lead ambassador or DataDev ambassador, lead developer, and Tableau extraordinaire. So Timothy, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. There's just one little thing I need to get set up here, and then we are ready to start.
Superstore Tableau server and steal all their top-secret sales data. I have set up an ADSL over IP connection to get on their network. Ha! Their security is a joke. I already broke through their third firewall, and now I'm using quantum computing to decrypt their roadbook's passwords. Their security team is no match for my lead skills. Who even uses read-only as password?
Right. So you have just witnessed a live hacking of Tableau server. Well, except, no, of course not. This is what the Hollywood movies would have you believe. But in reality, hacking is something quite different than what we see in the movies. Now, that being said, I know it's bad practice, but I think it is suitable in this case to open up the session with the definition for hacking from Wikipedia. Yeah, that's not the greatest presentation practice, but I did opt to do this in this case because there are 3 terms in here that will illustrate quite well what we're going to try and achieve today. I'll read the definition word by word, and then we'll get into those specifics. A hacker is a person skilled in information technology who achieves goals by non-standard means. And I'm already highlighting the first word, goals, because we have a few goals with today's Hacking Tableau 101 session. And the goal usually for these types of sessions should be learning. And effectively, that is the case here. Now, specifically in this case, it's about learning how Tableau functions. And we have certain means to achieve that. Another word in this definition that is relevant. And these means are tools that we also want to learn about and that I will showcase to you today. They are tools that are probably available to you and you might not even know that, but there are ways for you to hack, quote unquote, Tableau, to look into what Tableau is doing and how it is functioning that can help you learn about it as a platform. And that's the whole message of the session today. The final word, I guess, is skilled because, well, I've mentioned learning a few times already, and what we're going to be doing today is sharpening skills in information technology. So maybe you are an experienced programmer, maybe you're a less technical person, but I think that the things we're going to be looking at today should be teaching you a skill that could be useful in several different roles that are all close to Tableau as a platform. I think Kevin's done a very good job of introducing myself, so I don't need to do that again, but I'm effectively lead developer, so I build integrations around Tableau most of the time. And with that in mind, let's just go into the more formal presentation mode and look at what we're going to be doing today. Item number 1 on the agenda is how most applications work. An introduction to HTTP. That sounds very formal. It's almost as course-like as the title of the session. This is just about 5 minutes of theory that I think we require so that today we'd understand what we're going to be talking about. I said 5 minutes, so it's not going to be too long. You'll just have to bear with me, but there are a few important concepts as to how applications work that you will be taught, unless you, of course, already know them. That are very important to understand the rest of the things we're going to do with these tools. But that simple, short basis of theory should make the rest, the other 30 minutes, very, very interesting indeed. Because that is when we're going to be talking to Tableau with the REST API. So we are effectively going to converse with Tableau and ask it things. And that's, I know it's a very broad and abstract term because maybe you've already used Ask Data in the past, or you've used queries with Tableau Pulse nowadays. But this is different. This is us talking to Tableau as an application and using some of its functionalities to obtain results. And after all, that is what applications do. They show results to humans or they talk to other applications, but I shouldn't get ahead of myself. Those are concepts that will be illustrated in the first section. And we're going to take place in that conversation as well. We're going to take a place in that conversation by talking to Tableau. Now, just, having a polite conversation isn't really hacking, but it's going to get more and more interesting over time as we progress in the session, because we're going to start wiretapping Tableau's conversations without it necessarily being aware of that. So that's going to take it up one notch. And again, there's going to be tools here that are going to be showcased that would be interesting for us to look into those conversations and learn about them. We're going to go all the way to even manipulating messages in those conversations, but I'll leave that as a teaser, and then obviously some conclusion. But first, we need to get through that bit of theory that should take no more than 5 minutes. So let's just go through this. It is not very difficult, but it are important concepts that we need to be familiar with to proceed. So how most applications work. I'm sure some of you, we have a large audience. I'm sure some of you are experienced developers. I'm sure some of you are software engineers, maybe even computer engineers, and will be familiar with a model that's very frequently used in the domain of software architecture. And that's a layered model that kind of, how would I say, dissects an application, if you will, describes the different layers of an application, and those layers together enable the application to do what it does. These are models that are very common in computer theory, so again, maybe familiar to some of you. We're not going to go into a university degree of software engineering here, but there is a layer that we need to be familiar with, and that is the one shown here, both in the screenshot and listed on the slide. That is the interface. And very often that's a user interface that we will be familiar with. What you see in the little screenshot is effectively Tableau Mobile, and that's an interface that allows us to interact with Tableau as an application. It's a user interface because it is designed for users, but it's important to distinguish between user interfaces and other interfaces which also exist with applications. For example, applications can have things called APIs. This is the DataDev day. I'm sure this has been brought up 17 times, but just for the course here, API, application programming interface, is an interface not for humans to talk to an application directly, but to enable talking to that application through a programmatic way. So for scripts to do that, for other applications to communicate. And communication here is key, and that's the conversations that were alluded to earlier that we're going to be looking into. So the interfaces here are really what we're interested in because they are the gateway to the application, to Tableau. And that's where we're going to be, misbehaving is a big word, but that's where we're going to be acting today. The other layers are not that important today, but it's good to know that there are there's something called a presentation layer where entities such as a project, a workbook are represented. And while we don't need to know about a layer, it's good to know that these entities are represented elsewhere as well. Like in an interface, we can see a project. In the application layer, there is code that defines that project. There are more layers. There's a database where a project is effectively a row stored, and that's being used by the application, etc., etc. But for now, remember the interface, and we're going to see how the interface drives the functionality of all the other layers anyway. So the interface is really our entry point. Now, one example we just saw was we can interact through an interface with Tableau, in this case, Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud. All shown once again is that Tableau Mobile is such a user interface that we could be using. Now, aside from that, that could be different. I mentioned it before, but it's important to keep in mind in the context in which we're going to be operating that we could be a script, or there could be a script talking to Tableau through other interfaces, through other entry points for that application. And you see, if you're following the slides, a question mark appearing over the double arrow that symbolizes the communication. We're starting to home in on what's going to be important for us today. It is to effectively look into that communication, both in official and less official ways, and find out what's going on there, and ideally then learn from reading that communication. Now, there is one more item in the theory we need to touch on before we can proceed to the interesting hacking demonstrations, which is communication entails the use of a certain language. Now, some of you might be familiar with this as well, but the language that facilitates the communications between the Tableau mobile app or your browser and Tableau server or Tableau cloud on the other side is called HTTP. Now, HTTP isn't a language per se, it's more a protocol. But in our understanding for today, I think we can generalize a little bit, keep things simple, and say that HTTP defines the rules as to how the interface communicates with the application or enables that communication. In fact, a few examples will clarify this. But the one thing you need to know about it, and we'll get to the example in a second, is that HTTP defines that this communication should happen through requests and responses. And requests and responses is a very human thing, in fact, because an example that we could give about that is that when you sit at the table, you could be asking as a request, can you pass the salt? And a response could be, yes, here is the salt, and someone could be passing you that salt. Now, in a less day-to-day thing, at least for humans, but well, I mean, I guess viewing a web page is a day-to-day thing nowadays. But a request could be, can I view this web page? And then an answer would be, yes, here is the web page. The difference here is it's not two people at a table asking and responding. Here, this is your browser requesting, and it's a web server responding with the web page that you want to view. So this is effectively what happens all the time when you are in your browser and you type tableau.com, then your browser sends a request to a web server and it receives a response. This is the communication. This is what we'll do in just a moment. Now, those are very generic and simple examples, but we can build on that and go further. So another response could have been a less expected one, that your browser asks, can I view this web page? And the server responds, no, sorry, you do not have access to this. And a more Tableau specific example would even be, can I view this dashboard? And then you could get a response saying, sorry, this is not a dashboard you have access to. And this goes way beyond these examples, of course, but I think you get the idea of this communication happening. And the next examples that we're going to be showcasing will definitely clarify that further. Those are going to be the practical examples. Just bear in mind that I'm going to be using terminology as we go forward that is always about the request and the response, that communication between what you see on the left, the front end, the client, the browser, a script. That's all, what's usually forming the request. And then there's going to be the responding entity on the other side, the backend, the server, the application, Tableau server, Tableau cloud, the API. Those are all, kind of the same things in this context. And here is us then finally with this very cool AI generated hacker image in the middle that, we're listening in to these conversations. So, without further ado, I don't think there's another slide. Yeah, no, that should be it. Yeah, this doesn't matter. We're going to get to the much more interesting part, which is the live action. And for this, I'm going to actually share my screen, and we're going to get hands-on so that I can demonstrate to you the tools that we have. So at this point, my screen is visible. I'm sure someone will draw my attention if that is not the case. And we're going to start. Remember, we had the agenda with a very official and by the book type of communication. And what I'm showing you here is effectively the Tableau REST API documentation. So it is the supported and documented way of talking to Tableau, except it's not what you're used to. It's not you clicking around in the UI, because that's also talking to Tableau and requesting and responding. But this is what you use when you want to create a script that talks to Tableau. It is something that I'm sure many of you have experimented with. It's been presented before today. It will be presented after. But using these APIs is the first and foremost way of communicating with Tableau other than just using your browser. Now, how is this interesting? Well, we're bringing this up today as an example because it is the easiest to understand. It is the embodiment of the request response paradigm that we just looked at during the theory between something and the application. Now, one of the simpler examples we can probably think of is querying projects, right? You could be consulting this documentation because you intend to create a little application or a wrapper on top of Tableau that lists projects and allows users to navigate these. That's a perfectly valid use case for using the REST API. So with that, you would pull up this documentation and you would use the right tools to experiment with these API calls, with these API requests, as they're sometimes also called. You read the documentation, you see that you can effectively query projects to get a list, and that there are certain endpoints, as they call them, that you can use for that. This is where you will address your request, and that is in the form of a URI, which is a specific type of URL. And then there's all kinds of other documentation, and all of that, is very, very interesting, but there's a bit too much to go through for today. So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to pull up the first tool in our tool set today that I can showcase you, and we're going to demonstrate a request in there. This first tool is called Postman. I'm showing you this in the browser, and Postman is a tool designed so that you can test API calls, so that you can test HTTP-based requests and responses, and you can modify those and you can play around without having to evolve immediately to that setting of building a script that does that. It's much more ad hoc, and it has an interface that allows you to design your requests and see the responses and pull them apart so that you know what's happening and going on. So if you understand the basic concepts of HTTP that we just went through, then this is something that you'll very easily pick up, because I'm using a library here, a so-called collection, that in fact has all of these endpoints and methods that we just saw in the documentation, like query projects, and they're in here and they're predefined so that I can use them with the Tableau site that I'm signed into. So I'm using this same site we just saw a glimpse of earlier. This is my DataDev site, and I have projects on here. So now my intention is I want to query these projects. And again, lots of details on the screens, very powerful tool, but we don't need to go through all of that. What we want to see basically is the request and the response, and to learn from that. So I'm going to go and send the request. It's going to go to this URL. There's some variables in here, so no need to worry too much about that. But essentially, it's the same URI that we're seeing here. And as I send this, then there's going to be a moment where the messages go back and forth. And here I get a response from Tableau Cloud. Now, this is a good interface to browse through when it's zoomed out a bit, but it is a bit large as we're presenting today. So what I'll do is I'll just go into VS Code and put everything in here so it gets a bit clearer for us to look into this. And this is the first request response that we can analyze and learn from together. So what is there to say about this? First of all, the fact that this is human readable, but it's also structured. I guess that's my first observation. This is important to note, and this is because APIs, as we have referred to previously, APIs are programmatic endpoints that are designed to be used by programs, other applications, scripts, but they are being built and addressed by humans in the first place. So the format of the response we're seeing here is in fact, you could say, a compromise that has a negative connotation. I guess the middle grounds between having something that can be used by a script or an application, but also that can be understood by humans. Specifically, the language here is called JSON. I'm sure 98% of you will be familiar with that. Don't feel bad if you're in the other 2%, but basically, this is a very, very, very common language nowadays on the internet. Language defining not programming, but just a structure of data that is being exchanged. And let's start looking into the data, because I'm being very descriptive about what we see, but what's really in here. So first, there's a bit here that describes the pagination. In fact, what I'm seeing is that I have a total of 27 projects available. And then much more interesting is that I have a list of projects that are on my Tableau Cloud site, some of which have a name, well, I guess all of which have a name, some of which have a description, and they have IDs and content permissions, etc. So at this point, I'm already seeing interesting information that I'm not usually confronted with, quote unquote, as an end user, because I'm normally using the nice UI and I just, see what I see. But here, I have to say, as a data dev, my curiosity is piqued, and I'm starting to think, okay, look at this, that's interesting. Some projects have a parent project ID and some do not. I wonder what that means. In fact, yeah, it's completely missing or absent in this bit for the OAuth, the return project. Well, I think you could have a guess at this. It's not very difficult, right? We know the concepts of a top-level project and a sub-project. Well, I think it's relatively easy to infer that a project with a parent project ID is going to be a sub-project, whereas one that doesn't have one is a top-level project. And so I can check my hypotheses and seeing that, yes, there is a top-level project called OAuth the Return, but I'm not seeing this Tableau Cloud Reporter, though if I browse, and I forget actually, I suppose I could search. Tableau Cloud Reporter, this is a project, and yes, effectively it's a sub-project under Admin Insights. So, very interesting. I'm learning, right? Remember the definition in the beginning, our intention today is to learn. I'm learning about how Tableau, when it is exchanging information, understands the nature of a project, whether it's a sub-project or a top-level project. Now, maybe you'll find this very lame, but of course it's just the first step, we have to start simple. But I'm going to repeat this over and over in the next remaining 20 minutes. We need to continue being curious and think about, why things are being shown and represented the way that they are. I can ask questions about why content permissions are set in a certain way, and I can find out after some digging that that's actually the permissions being locked or not locked to a project, things like that. So that's going to be my encouragement as we go forward today, right now, and afterwards, try and find things that you want to explore and learn from. Well, this is a pretty lame example because it's the official documented way. It's the REST API, and everyone can find what's going on just by reading the documentation. But we're going to get to the next step, and that's going to become really interesting. Remember how we said we're going to first talk to Tableau in an official manner? Well, now we're going to start wiretapping or eavesdropping in a conversation, and that should be closer to what was promised in the title of the session, Hacking Tableau 101. So with that, I'm going to return to the browser here, and we're going to introduce the second tool for today. And the second tool is one that you all have at your disposal, but that most people don't really use with until they get familiar with developing these kinds of things. And these are your browser's dev tools or developer tools. And in any modern browser, you can go to your menu and then into some submenu. I got to find it, I guess. I always use the keyboard shortcut to open it. Oh yeah, more tools, developer tools, and will pop up on the other window here, but now here is a console and all kinds of other stuff, an interface that is very unfamiliar at first, but that will reveal itself as a very, very powerful set of tools in this context of learning and hacking as well. Now, remember request response, conversations, that's what we're interested in, and more specifically eavesdropping in this case. So what we're going to focus on is the tab that's currently on, the network tab. There's so much more you can do with the other ones, but for today, just the network tab. And what I'll do is I'll refresh the page to reinitiate these conversations, and you see all kinds of stuff happening on the right as well as on the left. On the left, we know what's going to happen. We're going to see our projects. But on the right, what we see effectively listed here is a large number of requests that were sent by my browser to Tableau Cloud and the responses that go with these. In fact, every single line embodies a combination of request response. And with these developer tools, I now have the power to actually listen in on that conversation. Now, listen in, eavesdropping, wiretapping, all sounds very hacky, but bear in mind, this is actually information I'm entitled to because this is merely the behind the scenes conversation of what my browser is doing to display the projects for me. So why would I not have the right to look into what is going on here? Now let's go to get projects, because this is the equivalent of what we just saw in the REST API, query projects, but this is using Tableau's internal API, if you will, an undocumented API that's behind what you see in your browser. This is called the Viz Portal API. In fact, if I go to other properties of this request called the headers, a lot of theory around that as well, very interesting, but just a detail for now, you'll see that the request URL that was used here specifies Viz Portal, and that's effectively the URI that this HTTP request went to, and that we got a response from in the form of more JSON. So why don't we pull this one up and put it in here? And you'll see that it looks very similar to what we saw before. I can toggle between the two, go back to the top. Similar in that sense that it's A, the same language, or the same structure, it's JSON, and B, that there are similar properties being returned, such as a total count, so the number of projects, such as the description of a project. There's a bit more in here as well, and this is again the curiosity being piqued. I could be asking, why is there other information in here, and why is this not the same response as the REST API call from earlier? Well, let's find out. It's all about just trying and seeing, interpreting what we have here, and making something out of that. I'm seeing some information that contains count in the name, and I see zeros and ones and other numbers. So I'm seeing workbook count, data source count, table count, child project count. If you are familiar with the Tableau UI in a different way, and that's just this little toggle here for the list view, then I think it's going to be immediately clear what these counts represent. Is actually the number of projects, workbooks, views, etc., within the project that is being returned in the response. Is this life-changing? No, probably not. But we're still finding out and learning about how communications happen. And I personally find this interesting to see that, okay, that is how these numbers are populated. Tableau is actually pulling them and getting them in the same response. So, okay, good to know, good to know. Controlled permissions, that's a different name for what we saw earlier, I'm guessing. I don't know everything about this, of course, but there is to be learned. I'm seeing IDs that we saw before. I'm seeing different IDs that are proper to the Viz portal, etc., etc. All very interesting. I can even scroll down. And in fact, what I see here is that aside from projects, we even get users, such as my own user that's being returned because I happen to be the owner of many of these projects. So, okay, again, I am learning about how these things come to be. Now, just a side note, that's interesting not only because we're being curious and geeky and because we think we're cool hackers, but also because at some point, you're going to be doing more complex stuff than getting a list of projects probably. And this is going to effectively teach you about why things are the way they are, why a user who might be on your Tableau environment comes to you and asks, why do I see this data? Why do I see these projects? Why doesn't this user have access to this? Sometimes these kinds of questions can be answered if you know where to look, if you know to look into the behind the scenes, the under the hood of what is going on here. So we don't have the time to go into specific examples and showcase all kinds of other examples of what you can find out. There's going to be a little more hacky stuff coming up. But know that, looking into these, you have the keys to the kingdom to find out about what's going on. In fact, maybe one more, because you saw there wasn't a single call, just like we had with the REST API, but there were a dozen, like many dozens, in fact. I think there's like 60, 70 calls taking place for us to just see the web page the way it was rendered on the left side here. It's again time to be curious and see, okay, we can eavesdrop on the list of projects that gets returned, but we can also eavesdrop on all of the other stuff that gets returned, such as this little icon, the fav icon, which is what's displayed in your tab here. But much more interestingly, one called get session info. And I might just copy and paste this response for us to go through. And that's a big one because you're seeing, wow, this is 1,379 lines long. And as I browse it, it's just a list and a list and a list and a list of properties. What can we learn from this? Again, we have to be curious. We have to see what's going on here and learn from that. So I'm seeing that there's a result and there is a site attribute or key, and there are all kinds of true or false properties, booleans being returned here, such as editing flows enabled or data alerts enabled. Again, this is going to probably prompt some investigation and trying to see where you can find these features in the UI, see if you can make sense of what is what. For today, just as what this actually is all kinds of features, functionalities, whether they are enabled or not in the UI for the site that you're signing into, and how Tableau knows what to enable and disable, what to gray out or what to make available in the UI. Now, again, not life-changing, except you're probably seeing things like, request access. That's a less familiar term than editing flows. So you can start wondering what that is about. Remote querying. I don't have the answer to that today, but there is maybe a point where I'm developing something and I could learn from what this might entail and how I can use it in what I'm working on, because it is actually the technical name for something I've been looking for, something like that. So there's a ton of them. There are really hundreds. But again, right, so there's a lot of information you can get to with these tools that you actually have access to. And knowing that these tools surface these to you in such a convenient way is just the first step in the learning experience. Now, on to the main course, I would say. We've just eavesdropped on a conversation that we were entitled to, but we can do more, and we can manipulate the messages that are being sent back and forth here. And for that, we're going to introduce the third tool for today. Remember, Postman for your traditional testing of the official API calls, simple stuff. DevTools to listen in on what's actually happening behind the scenes in your browser. And now, something a bit more technical, but, well, more powerful because it is more technical, is a so-called man-in-the-middle proxy. And depending on which operating system you prefer, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, there's going to be different variants and flavors of those to use. MITM proxy is one that runs from the command line. That's available on all three, including Linux. But Mac OS has their own. Windows has something called Fiddler that have a different UI, but they all essentially do the same thing, which we're going to showcase just by launching this. So I'm running a command line. I'm getting information about a proxy listening and a web server. That's all very fancy. We don't need to know the specifics. All I need to do for this to work, and there are a million tutorials about this, so don't worry about the specifics. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to instruct my computer to send all of its requests, not just the ones for the browser tab that I'm looking in, but all of the programs on my computer. It has to send all of that through this proxy. And as soon as I do that in the settings here, you're seeing some stuff come through. There is stuff from our webinar today, because that's this URL. There's stuff from Google, because there's Google software on my computer. I don't think I need to show you in all of the conversations between my computer and all of the apps I use, but I am going to filter a bit on Tableau, and I'm just going to rerun the same request as before and maximize this screen where we're seeing the responses, well, the requests and the responses, and you'll find very, very similar information. This is the get projects endpoint in the Viz portal that was queried by my browser, the other tab this time, but it could be any application. And I'm seeing a response here that has a few headers, but has the same body as before, right? Slightly different ordering, but in a sense, these results are the same. Now, we're not doing the same, we're doing more. We are manipulating the conversation. And this is where the power of this tool becomes interesting. I can now tell it to actually intercept results. And if I say, I want you to stop, to pause every result, or every request and response that includes get projects in the URI, I can specify that here. And then I can go and refresh the page once more. And you're going to see that it just keeps loading for now, because the tool that we're working with, MITM proxy, could be Fiddler, could be anything, has paused this request and allows me to open it and change it before it goes through to Tableau. Remember, request, response. So this is just the first bit, but I'm going to unpause. I'm just going to let the request play. I'm more interested in manipulating the response, which is now being shown here, because now I can mess around and do stupid stuff, and that's what I find funny and interesting. So remember, we had the top level project, we have BigQuery service account test. What if I actually said that there were 1 million workbooks in here? Oh, and the UI isn't great, but I can go and copy all this, put it in here, format it. I think you can just edit it however you see fit. But what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I have 1 million workbooks in here. I don't know how many zeros. And in the other top level project for admin insights, let's say that I have 666 data sources. I will now inject this result, this response in here. I think I need to say I'm done. I can resume. And when I go to Tableau Cloud, I see I have 1 million workbooks and 666 data sources. Very, very funny. And I really feel like a hacker right now. Now, all good and well. Is this useful? I think, again, yes, because it's a tool for learning. So this is the next step. After listening, we can see what we can change to trigger different behavior. Now, this example is silly, of course, but what again, if you're developing something and you're looking to understand what makes the behavior of a certain thing different, then that's just another tool you can use to do that. And this is a powerful one because, as I mentioned, it can be used with any application. So now we're going to go to the next level, and this is a final demonstration for this session. We have 4 minutes left. We're going to go and not listening to what our browser is doing, but we're going to open Tableau Desktop and see if we can get some interesting information happening, in that conversation. So let's fire up Tableau Desktop. It takes a moment. Those of you who followed the announcements at Tableau conference know that Tableau Desktop on Silicon is going to be released soon. So, hey, we're going to have much faster launch times for this. But here we go. So here's Tableau Desktop that started. And I'm going to be very specific about the example I have in mind, just to get to the point and not go over time. You see the Discover bar here on the right. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. Well, did you know that this is nothing more than a request that comes from Tableau? See here, there's actually a request going out to /app/discover/desktop. And the response for this is just an HTML document. So this is, in fact, a web page that we are seeing here that represents all of the resources that are listed in here. So this is a very well prepared example that I'm going to give you, but we can manipulate that as well. And this is going to be a practical example of something you can do. So what if I intercept that request and response, and I open Tableau Desktop one more time. And what I've done is I've prepared a little web page that I want to substitute this one with. So you see it's not loading right away because it's caught in my web here. And so now what I need to do is there's going to be a certain response. So I can say one more step. And I can say that the location here is somewhere on a server I have hosted here at Bistry where I work. And I'm going to resume. And then what appears here in my Tableau Desktop Discover pane is a customized pane for Bistry, for the company I work for, with specific resources that I want my Tableau creators to learn from when they open Tableau Desktop for the first time. So it's taken a long time, but now you're even seeing, through hacking, an actual business application of the learnings that we had from today. So you could put a web page, host that somewhere, and have your network infrastructure, your VPN redirect these requests and actually bring value to your Tableau Desktop users so that they can find links for learning quickly through this. But your imagination is the limit. So just back to one slide for the conclusions, which is going to be, let's see if I can find where we're supposed to be here. Yes, wrap up. So let's skip over the animations. I'm going to summarize it in one sentence because we're at time. You've seen concepts, including HTTP, request response, that are very important because they define how many applications work. Not all of them, but Tableau is one of them, and many, many others use it as well. You need to know that you have tools to understand that communication and see how it works and even manipulate it. And the final message is always to remain curious and continue using these on your running path to become a more excellent data dev than you already are today.
Amazing. Thank you, Timothy.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kevin, and everyone else.
Yeah, thanks again, Timothy. Nice work. I love the video at the beginning. That was fantastic.